it's right here. And the main thing I want you to notice here is that this yellow is kind of sand and gravel. A lot of this is glacial, but some of this is also beach deposits. But then you also have this clay that is along the shore of the Lake Superior. And that originates from, so this kind of pattern of where the clay is, you can see in this dashed line in here. And then the sand is up here. So this is when the glaciers, the last time the glaciers receded, about 14,000 years ago, there was a lake called Glacial Lake Duluth. And so the shoreline was kind of right at the edge of that, near the edge of that clay. And the clays are pretty famous for being pretty impermeable. Not much water travels through the clay, but the sand is much more permeable. So within the watershed, you have a couple very different kind of environments. And we'll see how that plays out in the landscape in a minute. So zooming in a little bit more, this is the divide I was talking about. So the clay is kind of the pinkish color, and then there's some sand and gravel here and there, and a lot of sand in the uplands. And there are a few peat areas, and so those are wetlands also in the area. And then in terms of land cover, a great majority of the watershed is forested, as people around here know. There is a little bit of agriculture, mostly in the Marengo area, and a little bit in the White River. Not much urban, not surprisingly. And some grassland and wetlands as well. But and this area is often talked about as very pristine, and in a sense it is, especially kind of by modern standards. There isn't a lot of urbanization. The Bad River is interesting for having no dams for a river its size. There's, I believe, one kind of major dam in the watershed. But this area was basically cut over in the late 1800s. And so while it is generally pristine, this cutting over of the landscape and then starting to grow hay in some places, removing a lot of the woody material, definitely had a big impact on the way that the streams function and the way that the rivers function. And while probably the impacts of that may be peaked around the 1940s or 50s, this is still an area that's recovering from that really big stress that happened in the late 1800s. And so all this is to say, really, the landscape shapes the streams. So we'll look a little bit closer, but the rivers don't just exist on their own. They're definitely a function of the landscape that they're formed in. And so if you look at sort of a cross section along the length of the river, here are two of the rivers in the watershed. The Bad River up here, the kind of blue, and then you've got the Marengo River. So up in the higher area of the watershed, behind where the volcanic rocks are, there is still some glacial till up at the top. But here it's sandy glacial till. The drainage network is not all that well developed. There are more wetlands there. There's more kind of rivers that don't have a big deep canyon of any kind. They're just kind of scattered around the landscape, and there are way fewer rivers. It goes through a transition area where the bedrock kind of outcrops, and that really controls things for a brief period as you go north. And then you get into this sandy post-glacial shoreline that I was talking about, so where the edge of that glacial Lake Duluth was. There you start to see more of a pickup of sediment. You start to see valleys actually cutting down with pretty steep banks. And then once you get out onto that clay plain, which was the finer sediments coming out of the lake, it's more entrenched. You get alluvial valleys and much flatter. So I have a few images to kind of show characteristics of this. But first, I meant to show this earlier. But you can really see, even without seeing the clay and the sand, like I was showing before, if you look at the shape of the streams, you can see that line really well. So basically, tracing along this area here, where you're in the sand, where you're in the clay, closer to the shore, the streams are much denser. There are a lot more streams per unit of area, and a lot of these little parallel channels. And that's because when rain is falling on the ground, not much soaks into the ground. A lot of that is running off because it's hitting the clay and running right off into the surface water. So that creates this characteristic, really dense network. And there's a very sharp contrast right when you get to the edge of that and get up into the rock and sand. You can see that the channels are not nearly as parallel and uniform, and they're a lot more scattered around on the landscape. So it's a very big contrast. So looking up above, kind of in this glacial till area, this is kind of characteristic of how the streams look. So like I said, there isn't a really steep cut-in valley. There's a lot of kind of swamp and wetland around it. But then you go through this transition zone, and if you've ever been to Copper Falls, you've seen this place. But this is kind of amazing. In the 30s and the 1950s, there wasn't much of a change. There's actually another picture from sometime right around the turn of the century, like 1905 or so. It looks pretty much like this as well. But then when you look today, this fall is much, much shorter. And I think it was the flood of 1960, there was a lot of material was broken loose during that flood and created a very rapid change in the landscape. So that changed the shape. It dropped almost 20 feet in this kind of one event. And that's how a lot of these things happen in this part of the watershed during really high flow events. Big pieces of material can break off, and there's kind of a filling in, and then it all comes back to an equilibrium after that. So moving further north down into the watershed, we get out into the clay areas, and so one of the things that we see here, and Faith Fitzpatrick, who gave me these slides and was originally going to be coming tonight, has done a lot of work on looking at the nature of these landslides and the stability of these hill slopes. And a lot of the erosion that's happening in these areas is still, like I said before, still kind of a function of the fact that this was all cut over, and for a while there was so much bare land. I haven't really explained kind of what our role, the USGS, what my agency does, so maybe I'll do that a little bit right now. We're not a regulator, so we don't make or enforce any kind of rules. That's left to other agencies. But what we do is we provide the science information that people need to make decisions, and we never take a side on any kind of issue, including this one. So, but one of the things that we kind of our gold standards are stream gauging. We have a 130-year history of measuring water flow and water levels all over the country, and we've developed techniques that are really robust. So a few years ago, we had a gauge installed on the Bad River, and it just happened to be that one of these erosion events happened very near the gauge soon after we had put it in place. And so you can see we're measuring two things here. One is turbidity, so that's basically the cloudiness of the water, how much sediment there is in it. And the other is the flow rate, or discharge. And you can see it's just kind of going along, and then suddenly crickets, like nothing. We saw nothing for I think it was actually about half of a day. And then suddenly turbidity shot way up, and flow shot way up. And what had happened here was a bank had collapsed, and these are pictures taken where this happened. The bank collapsed and completely dammed the river for about half of a day. And then once it broke through, obviously the turbidity was very high because there was all kinds of sediment that suddenly got in the water. The flow rate was really high, just like a dam break, because that's exactly what it was, a dam break. And then things kind of return back to normal.
Ice flow do the same thing? Spring
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that's happening in the area is in a lot of these floods, there's quite a bit of sediment that's being pushed over the banks to the floodplain outside of the Narrows River channel. And so here, I believe a couple feet of sand was deposited in the Marengo River just after one of these flood events. And as you get closer to the mouth of the Bad River, this is getting close to the Bad River sloughs, you can see this pretty interesting contrast between sort of the pre-European settlement, before everything was cut over, and after. So prior to that, this probably would have been the water level. It wouldn't even be cutting through the peat. This is all kind of wetland material. But now it's actually cutting through this, and then periodically there's a lot of sandy alluvium, which is just the term for sediment transported by the river. So there's a lot of large woody debris at the period of time when the cutting over happened. So there were all these, debris from trees that was allowed to flow down the rivers. But then that's kind of ended, and now it's a lot of sandy sediment that's being deposited now. So there's been this remarkable change, and the streams are still sort of adapting to that big change. And of course, stream flows respond to climate. They're driven by water that falls as precipitation. So, like I said, our agency's pretty old. So we actually have records going back to the teens, and then unfortunately there was a gap. But the biggest flow ever recorded on the Bad River that we recorded was in 1946. And then that flood that really changed Copper Falls is that April 1960 flow. But then you can see, with those as an exception, it was kind of quiet. There was a lot of drought in the 70s, and then the 80s were kind of quiet, but then in the 90s we saw, in 1992 there was a big event, another one in the early 2000s, and then lately it's been a little bit quiet. But how does this compare? Wow, that.
Was that a bat?
Nature.
Big one.
I don't have anything in my hair. So how does this compare to kind of the rest of Lake Superior? So as part of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and some other initiatives that have been going on, there's been a lot of record keeping and trying to compare what's happening to stream flows and precipitation throughout the Lake Superior region. And so we can look at kind of breaking out into like 20 or 30 year clusters, that there's been quite a decrease in precipitation over the last 30 years. So, there it is. All right. I think it'll be back.
It's kind of a big bodied bat.
All right, so looking at ironwood as representative of the Bad River, you can see that there's been a pretty significant decrease in precipitation over the last 30 years. But then what does this do to stream flows? I gotta keep my eyes open. This also means that the mean annual flow. So if you look at the flow over the course of the year and just take the average, you can see that that's also dropped quite a bit, up to maybe 30% in the Bad River over the last 30 years. Maybe you'll invite in a friend.
I think we should just ignore the bat. I don't think there's much we can do about it.
If you turn the step ladder sideways and block the opening,
What's that?
turn
Has
the
he
step
gone in
ladder
there?
sideways.
Has he gone back in again?
Yeah.
Recognize himself, flutter
There
around.
you go.
There's a door. Oh, maybe we can get in the door.
That'll mess up the
Ray,
bed.
does anyone need a pen for their cards?
How often does this happen during your USGS meeting?
All the time. I love that. It's my pet.